quorum, I would think, so we'll move forward. I think the first thing we're going to do is approval of minutes. We ready to go?
Sure. I just want to make sure we got the closed caption up on the screen up ahead.
Okay. Do you want introductions and all that first before the minutes, or how do you like to do this?
Usually we've been doing the minutes and then you go through the introductions.
Okay.
And then
So we have minutes from November 26, 2019, and hope everybody had a chance to look at them and looking for a motion to approve those minutes.
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Okay, we have a motion. We have a second. Yes, we do. Any discussion?
No.
Hearing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. All right, introduction of visitors. So we got a small enough group, we can start over here at probably Lauren.
Yes, I'm Lauren John Carter, outside counsel with Fpdr.
Nelson Hall, Bennett Hartman.
Kristen Johnson, liaison from Commissioner Hardison's office.
Stacy Jones, Fpdr.
Del Stevens, retired firefighter.
Ty Walters, retired firefighter.
And Mitchell, Fpdr.
Franco Lucci, City Attorney's Office.
those and you in the back?
Rob Hutchins, Fire Liaison to Fpdr.
Jessica Bucola, police liaison. Dr. Sandra, Fpdr.
Sam Hutchison, Director.
Thank you. And I'm Jason Lehman. I am one of the trustees representing everybody, but elected by the firefighters.
Catherine McLeod, citizen trustee.
And Brian Hunsaker, trustee.
All right. We could probably start really quick by talking about the work session that was supposed to happen due to conflicts. We had to cancel it. It wasn't for any specific reason. It was just we wanted to have everybody here for the meeting. So I know Dell had signed up to speak. So I think our intention is to reschedule that meeting and decide after we get our advice from our attorneys and anybody else who has some information for us, how we'd like to move forward on the either forming committee or how we want to go from there. So I don't know what I had heard you wanted to speak, Dale, but you didn't know what area of the meeting to speak in. So was it on that you wanted to speak?
I wanted to talk about the possibility of establishing a work committee to look at the pension benefits, compare our pension to the PERS pensions, and look at disparities. And, I mean, I thought that the board was going to give us an announcement if you're going to do that.
So first, we wanted to
And I
have that.
comment on that is what I'd like to do.
Okay, well, we want to have that work session first before we can decide if we're going to move forward with that. I'm not saying we are or we aren't, but we wanted to have an informed meeting where we had our council and our experts here to kind of walk us through that, and then we can make a decision as a board where we want to go from there, whether it's to form a committee or not. But we at least want to get to that point first. Okay with that? Okay, thanks, Dale. So public comment period, did we have anybody else signed up?
Just Mr. Stevens.
You want to forego that for now?
Well, I can make a few comments if I may.
Okay.
Before we get started, I want to establish some credibility. I did this once before, about 4 years ago. This was given to me after I'd completed
Careful there.
a term on the pension board. Now, I want you to know that I appreciate all the people that serve on the pension board and help to make our system function. And I spent about 2 years working on reforming our pension. And anyway, I was given that certificate, but
Could you, so
I
for
guess
the
what
people
I'm-
that didn't see it, Dale, could you tell everybody what this is? Because
What
out
we
there, they
did?
don't know what you just
Okay.
handed us.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. For those that don't know, there was a law that was passed in 1973. It was called the Equal to or Better Than Law. And that is what
You
set-
can probably pull back a little bit. It's getting kind
Okay,
of, yeah.
all right, thank you.
Yeah.
That's what determined the fact that all public employees in the state of Oregon had to have benefits that were equal to or better than those provided by PERS, okay? That applied to active and retired people. Well, at that time, I was paying attention to those things, and I knew that there was a lot of controversy in smaller departments. They were struggling to have benefits, trying to get their pensions in order, trying to get their health benefits, their insurances, all that. And so I monitored that, and I talked to some pretty knowledgeable people, and I talked to the man that actually wrote that law. And he was a firefighter in District 10 Fire Department. And so anyway, in 1984, District 10 Fire Department was consolidated into Portland, and they came in, okay? They had a private pension system prior to that, and they wanted to get into a better system. They wanted to get into PERS. And so that legislation was actually drafted, and it was taken down to Salem. Few modifications in committee, but it was passed, and they became PERS members, okay? At that time, I realized that we had a system that, even though it had been in place for a long time, it was really outdated, and it hadn't kept pace, and it wasn't equal in benefits to the systems that were available now, whether private or public. And I wanted really bad to see our members given the same benefits that other members were getting. And so Randy Leonard, he made a motion with the city council and with the mayor to establish a task force and look at our pension and compare it to PERS, okay? And so I ran for the pension board at that time, and that's all that certificate does is just establish the fact that I spent 3 years on that pension board, and I became part of that process, and I served on the mayor's task force. And I tried to be as open-minded as I could about benefits and about funding. I wasn't trying to get a windfall for the members, and I wasn't trying to rob from the city, but I thought that we had to be fair, and we had a standard that we had to meet, okay? That was a very frustrating process, and it was really hijacked, to be honest with you, because when I went on it, I expected that we were looking at the possibility of going into PERS. That's one option, okay? Anyway, I went and I met with the director of PERS on my own and asked him about the process to have our members go into PERS. And I'm not going to go into a lot of history on this because I could talk for several hours, but I do want you
Got a
to
couple
know
minutes here,
that
Dale.
that we really beat this around the bush, and my union finally told me that we don't want to go into PERS. We just want to improve our pension, and we want you to stop trying to do that. And I said, well, you know, we've got to compare our benefits to the PERS benefits if we're going to arrive at a mutual standard. Otherwise, we have nothing for a comparison. And anyway, the director of PERS, he was delighted to meet with me. I had an hour talk, and he said, I would be happy, he said, to come and speak to your task force. He said, we'd love to have you join us. He said, our pension, he said, is very efficient. It provides good benefits. He said, we're constantly upgrading it. And he said, 80% of our retirement benefits are paid out of earnings from our investments. He said, the city of Portland does not have that. He said, your pension system is really expensive. And he said, every year they have to have taxes to cover all of their operating expenses. He said, there's no money that's actually generated. So I went back and I told the task force about that. And I said, this man is very intelligent. He's talked to me about the fact that we could join PERS and that we could do it on a contract, a 30-year contract, and he said that it would be to the advantage of the members and the city. And boy, I'll tell you, they just tore into me. They didn't want to hear that. They did not want to go into PERS. And they didn't want to give up the old plan that we had, but they just wanted to upgrade it. So we spent a year doing that, and the city hired an actuary, and he was,
I don't mean to cut you off.
yeah.
I don't mean to cut you off or anything, but
That's all
what
right.
I'm hearing you articulate is a lot of good details and things like that I think are probably sufficient for the group that we're trying to get together, right? I'm not trying to say I don't want to listen to the same details twice, but the details, if I hear you correctly, that you're trying to articulate to us are discussion points that you would like to have
Yeah,
openly in that work group session that we're trying to have, right?
It's true, and I
Right.
was trying to get to that point, but
Yeah.
maybe I spent too much time on history.
Right.
I wasn't trying to do that.
Right.
But anyway, I just want to tell you that we never really got to a point where I felt that we had developed a optimum pension system. And even though it was finally voted on, and the members voted on it, police and fire, and then the citizens voted, and it was upgraded, put into effect, I never felt that our benefits were the same or equal, okay? And as it turned out, and I got challenged on this by several people, in 1990, when it went into effect, they did a study, and Portland failed. It failed the same year that went into effect, okay? So some of those defects were still right there in the new pension plan, and it's been that way ever since. And I would like to see the pension board commit itself to looking at the differences between our pension and the PERS pension, and looking at how modifications could be made to help the members and make it better. That's all I'm concerned about. At the last meeting, I think I asked everybody in the board, what happens if a member dies without a spouse, and nobody knew the answer? Well, it turned out that Mr. Hutchison enclosed a brochure in the monthly pension checks that was sent out, and he actually answered that himself, and he said that if you die without a spouse or minor children, your pension ceases, and that's what I told you back then. I mean, that is a huge loss that somebody endures at the end of their life and their career. Under PERS, and I didn't get to say this before, they get to will the portion that is in their employee account to anybody that they want to. And so they can cover a crippled person. They can cover a sick member or a father or a mother. And like in my case, just a quick example, I've got a daughter in a wheelchair that can never be self-supporting. I would love to be able to leave something for her to help her out. I don't have that option. And I think it's cruel that we have not addressed that. We didn't do it back then, and we should have. I think it could be done now. And I think the process is transparent enough that nobody would object to letting somebody take a portion of their final pension and direct it to a family member.
Okay, Bill, so.
So
that's
anyway,
it's an example. It's good.
That's what I was going to talk about. And we
stuff
can
at
do
the
that later.
work session.
Mr. Jimkowski was going to be here. He didn't make it. But he's an example of somebody that's got extreme disability, and he's been fighting for the issue that his disability status has been taken away. It's because we've now decided that we don't have a disability retirement system, and that's required by state law. I mean, we need to talk about that. We're not legal right now.
You did understand that we're going to talk about this stuff, right, at our work session?
I couldn't hear everything you said, Jason.
Do you know that that's what we're going to discuss at our work session? That's the plan.
I hope
We would
so.
have talked
I hope
about
we
it today.
will.
Yeah, we will.
And I'll engage in that. I'll be part of it. I'll be
Okay.
glad to. And I'm not trying to be divisive or use up city's time or anything. I just want to see our members get the best benefits. I spent 3 years as the president of our retired firefighters, and I've had about 3 members a month die. And so I've been there and seen the last phases of people's lives that were city employees. And if there's a way that we can help those people and make that transition better, I would like to see us do it. And I think it's possible to do that. I really do. So anyway, I'll confine my comments to that for now. But
Okay. Thanks,
anyway,
Dale.
please don't forget it, that it's an issue that really needs to be addressed.
Yep, we look forward to
Thank you.
meeting and having the work session.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dale. Next action item is 2021 budget.
Yeah, I'd like to clear one thing up on the work session. I think we're getting cross on it. The work session that we were going to have today and will maybe likely be leading off the next board meeting was a work session between the trustees and the council with Fpdr staff. It was only going to be between those parties. The public can listen, but the public will not contribute or testify during that because it's strictly legal decisions design, and the intent was to give you the information to clarify some of the legal positions, and then you could decide how to move forward if you want another type of work session, public work session, or do anything from there, because you all were asking to get the legal issues clarified, and that's what that work session today was scheduled to do. Okay.
All right, you all know me, but for the record, Stacy Jones, Fpdr Finance Manager, here to talk about next year's budget, the fiscal year 2021 budget. So that is for the fiscal year that will begin July 1st, 2020 and end June 30th, 2021. So just as a reminder, Fpdr is the only bureau in the city where council does not have budget authority. You all have exclusive budget authority, exclusive authority to adopt the budget. But you can't levy the tax. So council has to levy the tax in June. So we do participate in the citywide budget process just so we get wrapped in to the whole city budget, and council will levy our tax. So we will, I'm going to present the staff recommended budget, and then we will turn in a budget to the city budget office tomorrow that includes any changes that you all want to see. And then the process from there is that the mayor will release a proposed budget at the end of April or the beginning of May, and then council will make whatever changes they want to make to it. They won't make changes to our budget except for sort of technical things that I'll talk about at the end, and then they'll adopt the budget in June. So there can be changes made to this budget after you adopt it, and those are limited to areas where we intersect with other bureaus' budgets, and council has changed those bureaus' budgets, but I'll talk about that at the end. So, and I will always bring those back to you, I promise.
Is there copies of these available for us? There is?
I thought they were in your books.
No, they weren't ready by the time our.
Oh, right, and then I think Kathy sent them out a week later. Yeah, the budget is kind of the one exception to things going out 2 weeks in advance. We are still, even when we send it out to you 1 week in advance, we are before lots of different city deadlines, and so we're still, mucking around with this thing. We sort of cut everybody off, The police bureau calls us, can we please change this? And we just say, nope, it's too late. We give them deadlines, but our deadlines are, we're trying to make them fit with the city process, which is usually a little bit later, although this year it syncs up pretty well. There's also a longer forecast document that also went out about a week ago that you may or may not have copies of. It has a lot more detail about all the things I'm going to go over. And there are literally, like 100 pages of things that we have to turn into the budget office, but I didn't give all of that to you. But if you want to see the whole thing, feel free to let me know, and I will send you all 100 pages of just the different city budget process requirements. So for the first slide, because I'm sadistic and like to force you to look at lots of numbers, this first slide is a lot of numbers. This does, but I like to put this out right at the beginning because it does give you an overview of all of the numbers that I'm going to talk about, all on one page. So since this is a table with a lot of numbers, let me orient you to it. So going across the top, horizontally are years. We start out with fiscal year, the last year for which we have complete actuals, actual spending and actual revenues, which is fiscal year 18-19, because it's good to kind of, orient yourself to reality. Even for the budget, it's good to orient to reality. Probably in all human endeavors, it's good to orient to reality. The next column is the budget for the current year, and then the next column is what we project we're going to spend or receive for the current year, because now, of course, we adopted the budget many months ago and things have changed slightly. And then the next column is the budget we are recommending to you for next year, for fiscal year end 2021. And then the next 4 columns are forecast for the next 4 years, because we always do a budget for the next year and then 4 forecast years, so you can kind of see what's coming at you. And then that very last column shows the percentage change from the current year projection to the last year of the forecast. So don't be alarmed when you see those great big percentage numbers there. That's over 5 years, not over 1 year. And then, of course, going down along vertically are the different categories of items, starting with resources on top and requirements or expenditures down on the bottom. And then running along the very bottom is expenditures net of tax anticipation notes. And I kind of talk about this every year, that since we receive the TAN revenue and then repay the principal in the same fiscal year, it inflates the size of the budget to include those numbers. So if we leave in the costs of the TANs, which is interest and debt issuance, but take out the principal repayment, that's what that total net of TANs number is. And then going along the bottom, you can see the growth in each year going forward for the budget and the forecast. And that last number, the 6.5%, in the very bottom right corner of the slide is the average annual growth going across. This is really similar growth compared to recent experience. It's exactly what we would expect. It seems high, 6.5%, but as we've talked about before, those are the downstream effects of the 2006 changes and putting all of the new employees 2007 and later into PERS. So consequences of pre-funding a generation of pensions at the same time we're kind of closing out our pay-as-you-go pension plan. And then just, why 5 years? Why do we go out 5 years? The simple answer is because we're required to. Everybody who has their own fund is required to do a 5-year financial forecast by the city, but I would do it even if it wasn't required. It's good practice. 5 years is a reasonable amount of time to go and have some degree of faith in what you're projecting, and it makes sure that we're not surprised by anything that's coming down the road. I mean, we could still be surprised, but we limit our surprises. So slide 2 has fewer numbers on it, so I'm getting nicer as I go along. But these are really just the same numbers as on the previous slide, but there are fewer of them because this allows you to focus on next year's budget a little bit more instead of looking at everything across all 5 years. So this just has, actuals again for the most recent fiscal year, current year budget, current year projected spending and revenues, and what we are recommending for next year's budget, with the column showing the percentage change just from the current year to the budget year. You can ignore that big growth in tax anticipation note, fund level requirements, ending fund balance. Those big percentage growths are just a function of when you're switching from actuals to budget, because we don't budget ending fund balance, at least at Fpdr we don't. But everything else is growing pretty much as we would expect it to. The only thing that might jump out at you looking at this table is that since property taxes fund pretty much all of our expenses, you'll see that property tax revenue, which is the top line, is only needing to grow 6%. And when you hop down to requirements and look at those first two lines, FPDR pensions and PERS contributions, which are almost all of our expenses put together, those two, you'll see that the growth rate is higher, 6.2% for pensions and almost 17% for PERS. And so property taxes are not growing as quickly as expenses. And the reason for that is beginning fund balance is larger in the current fiscal year than it has been. So it's about $7.7 million higher, which we did talk about last year, but I'll talk about again a little bit more. So basically, we're sitting on an extra almost $8 million that we don't need to go out then and levy in the form of the tax next year, which is why property tax growth is not quite as high as expenditure growth. So obviously, stop me whenever you have a question. You're all nodding like, yep, we've heard this 100 times before.
That's a good thing, right?
That's a good thing. Yes, it's a good thing. We like when fund balance comes in exactly where we predicted it, but we didn't know Comcast was going to pay us, property taxes they owed us 10 years ago. And things like that happen. And yeah, getting more money. It's better for Comcast to pay than the taxpayers. Exactly. Well, I guess Comcast is a taxpayer. So anyway, moving on to slide 3. So those of you who have heard all of this many times, and I am aware that it sounds very similar every year, so I try to, change the format of the presentation at least every year. But those of you who've heard this many times might like to know upfront if there is anything that really is different or changing for this year. So I put some things up here that are worth pointing out as being unique this year. The first is that this is the first year I can remember that the first year ever since I've been at the city, I think, where we have no sworn labor contracts in place for July 1st. So it's not unusual to not have one of those labor contracts in place, but the PFFA, Portland Firefighter Association contract expired June 30, 2019. And the city and the union have both declared impasse, and binding arbitration is scheduled for April on that right now. So hopefully we will know what that contract looks like by July 1, but it's possible we will not. And we have not yet seen the last best offers that the arbitrator will choose between. So we really don't know exactly what the parameters of that contract will be yet. The Portland Police Association contract expires June 30, 2020, and negotiations are really just getting started on that, so we don't know what that will look like. And the Portland Police Commanding Officers Association, which is just the lieutenants, I haven't even heard anything about that yet, so, but it expires June 30, 2020 as well. And then, of course, we have a handful of non-represented sworn employees, and we never know what they're going to be paid because they don't have contracts, but there's just a small number of them. So it's unusual to have that degree of uncertainty, and having that degree of uncertainty in wages, and I'll talk a little bit later about how wages really hit everything in our budget, sworn wages. That is unusual. So in the absence of knowing, we have just budgeted for cost of living adjustments to wages based on the consumer price index that the city uses, which is the CPI West Region Size A index. And we have included retroactive pension COLAs for PFFA since their contract expired June 30 of last year. But we don't know what will actually happen. But that is what we have put in the budget, and we have got some money in contingency to cover anything else that may come up.
And roughly what percentage is that?
That is 2.9%, when we do have that number and know that number. So if that is the number that continues, and that is also the index that's in the current contracts, all three of them. In fact, I think it's in every city labor contract, so if that continues, it will be 2.9%. So we have a high degree of confidence in that number at least. The uncertainty is much more around whether or not there'll be retros in the Portland Firefighter Association contract, and whether or not there'll be any above COLA wage increases, or whether the contracts will require additional hiring, which sometimes happens when you change schedules or you do different things with units. Sometimes you need to hire, wind up adding positions. So those are the two things that could happen.
Is this a valid, appropriate time to ask about vacancies, like for the police, for example? How are those factored into the budget?
Yes, so we ignore the number of positions that a bureau has at police. Well, that's not always true. We ignore the number of positions that the police bureau has because they always have a lot of vacancies, and they're still running about 100 vacancies, and that's been the case for many years now. They do have a really, and so we just build the budget saying this is what you have now, and this is what we agree, and it's a long negotiation process, you're going to hire over the next couple of years. Now at fire, very simple. They say, well, we think we're going to hire 12 or maybe 24. That's what they always hire. We know they can hire those people. Fine. At police, they have very aggressive hiring plans, and so aggressive they beyond what they've done in the past. And so they want to hire 100 officers a year. We don't know if that's actually going to happen, but we don't want to not be able to come up with the money. So you'll see later in our budget that we have pretty aggressive hiring estimates for police, not as aggressive as they might say, but still pretty aggressive.
Okay, so there is some accommodation made for vacancies,
Yes.
but not the full range.
But
of
not the
vacancies.
full,
Okay.
because we know they have we know that we feel like we know that they can't hire 100 officers in the next year. But we'll say, all right, maybe you can hire 70 or 80. We'll budget for that. And then if police ever did get it, so if the PPA contract adds positions, not really a budget impact because they have a capacity problem. They can't hire those extra people anyway. And we already are seeing a little bit of that because council added positions to police 2 or 3 years ago, and there's no immediate budget impact because they can't fill them. Now, if council added positions at fire, I'm pretty confident fire can fill those positions, and so there we would see an immediate budget impact. But yes, that's, a big part of how we think about budgeting for these, and positions versus people in the door. Because positions don't cost us anything, but people in the door sure do.
Is your 2.9 projected, or is that the past? Because the past was higher than 2.9.
2.9 is actual, and so what the city does is they do the change from the second half of, so now it would be the second half of 2017 second half of 2018 to the second half of 2019. And we got that data about 2 weeks ago. from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who are the people who keep track of these things, and it is 2.9%.
If you budgeted in the CPI from last year into the PFFA, that's a 3.6.
Yes, and that was 3.9, I believe, last year. And so we budgeted that full 3.9 for PFFA.
As a kind of a reserve fund in case that comes. Okay.
Yep. So that way, we're ready if that retro is included in the arbitrator's decision. Yes, exactly. Second thing that's...
Could I ask you, so how would the retro, how would that affect the pension?
Oh, it affects everybody, right? Well, I mean, really almost everybody. So FPDR 1 pensions, their pensions are a percent of firefighter pay every July 1. So they would get a 3.9% increase. And then everybody who retired, for the FPDR 2s, it's just this subset. Everybody who retired between July 1st, 2019 and whenever that goes into effect would have had higher final pay if that COLA had been in place, and the charter requires us to recalculate their pay, even if the city never pays them. We're going to pretend that they did. So then we'll go through and increase all those FPDR2 folks. And then everybody who was on disability after that date, they would have had higher replacement pay. So we'll go back and calculate retros for everybody who was on disability, whether long-term or short-term, and then PERS contributions. Everybody, because the city will pay out a big retro, PERS contributions will come out of that, and we'll have to be on the hook for our share.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily a huge number. I think it's, gosh, I just had my staff calculate, I think it's in the $200,000 range right now. But it is complicated to calculate because it ripples through all these little tiny pieces. But we're getting pretty good at it, getting faster at it. I already mentioned the higher fund balance. I don't need to go into too much more detail about that. And then this last item is not, doesn't really impact our budget directly, but it does impact our tax rates. And I think it's interesting, which is that real market value in Portland for the first time in a long time didn't grow much. It only grew 2% last year, and we got these numbers a couple of months ago. So for the last 7 years, RMV has been at the low end, it's grown 5% annually, and at the high end, it's grown 18% annually. So RMV coming in at just 2% this year, that's significantly below normal. So that does put a little bit more pressure on our RMV rate, but not really anything significant given the amount of growth we've seen before this year. And then also assessed, but then on the flip side, assessed value, which is what property taxpayers actually pay taxes on, grew more than we expected, grew a lot, 4.5%. And measures 5 and 50 in the state of Oregon limit assessed value growth on existing properties to 3%. So that means we've added a lot of new properties to the rolls in Portland. And the nice thing about that is that we're spreading our tax bill now among more taxpayers. So that's putting less pressure on the AV tax rate. So kind of some interesting results this year for RMV and AV. All right, any questions before I dive into all the nitty-gritty? So let's talk first about expenses, which is the thing we need to talk about the most, and then we'll turn to revenues. This pie chart shows all of our expenses for fiscal year 2021, what we recommend we budget for expenses. Again, taking out that TAN principal repayment. And every year I say this, but I could, if I had to give a one-sentence summary of this entire presentation, it would be we spend almost all of our money on pensions and we get almost all of our money from property taxes. And there are a lot of other things happening around the margins, very important things from a policy perspective, but from a financial perspective, I think it is helpful to remember that that really is it in a nutshell. We get a bunch of property tax revenue and we turn around and we pay a bunch of it out in pensions. And there's a lot of complexity in how we do that, but that sums it up. So the pieces of this budget, this looks almost exactly like last year. Direct FPDR pay-as-you-go pension benefits are 74% of next year's budget. PERS contributions are 13%. That's up just a little bit from last year. Last year they were 12%. That's what we would expect. They're the fastest growing part of our budget. Disability benefits are about 4% of budgeted spending for next year. Administrative expenses, 2%. And what I call fund management expenses, things like contingency and general fund overhead payments, and I'll go into a little more detail on what those are, 7%, which is a little bit less than it was last year because contingency as a percent of the fund budget was a little bit less. So really, I mean, this looks very similar to what you saw last year. And an interesting thing to just think about when you look at this chart is if you put together the blue, which is the FPDR pension benefits, and the orange, which is the PERS contributions, And the gray, which is the disability benefits, well, that's 91% of our budget. And those are all charter-defined plan benefits. And if you look at fund management expenses, that's almost all contingency, and that's another 6%. So now we're talking about 97% of our budget is really very non-discretionary. So unlike if you were, say, a parks board, and you were up here, you would be making a lot of policy choices about, do we want to open this park or close this park or charge this much for swim lessons? The FPDR budget is very much a methodological exercise more than a policy exercise, which is fun for me, but maybe not that much fun for you. But we still have to talk through all of it. So let's take a closer look at the biggest part of our budget, which are those FPDR pension payments. This is about 75% of our budget right here, as you just saw. The chart on the left, again, just to orient you, is in millions. And going along the bottom horizontally, we start with actuals from last fiscal year, projected spending for the current fiscal year, our recommended budget for next fiscal year, and then the forecast year, so you can see how it's growing. And I try to highlight the budget year in yellow so you can grab onto the number you're being asked to approve this year. So like I said, this is the big kahuna for us. Unfortunately, there are no real surprises here. It's growing about 6%, which is very similar to what it's been growing for the last several years. Underneath that, the FPDR1 benefits are declining. We project they'll be down about 3.5% next year, and that's just mortality in that much older pool of retirees and beneficiaries. FPDR2 benefits continue to increase. That's mostly adding new folks to the pool as they retire, and there's not a lot of mortality in that population yet. But we also have wage growth. The cost of living adjustments I just mentioned, and you've all heard me talk about this before too, but Portland Police Association had big above COLA wage increases for the last 3 years, and those filter through more and more as those folks benefit from that and retire. And then a small above COLA increase at fire also. So that's also driving some increases in the pension budget. Just for fun, I promise you this is fun. It's probably fun to Trustee McLeod because she's an actuary, so this probably is fun. We talk about the pension budget and we kind of skim over it, and it's 75% of our budget. And behind that budget are all kinds of models and months of painstaking work and a lot of assumptions. And when we talk about this being a methodological exercise, this is really the heart of it. And so I thought I would share with the board, which I never really have, just a little glimpse into that world and those assumptions. Some of those assumptions come from our actuaries from Milliman, who do an experience study periodically and help us nail down those assumptions with actual data. Some assumptions come from mortality tables from mortality data in the larger PERS pool that we then adjust for our population. Some of those assumptions are internal, where we're looking at actuals for a particular, eligible group of people or our own historic experience. But so there's a bunch of assumptions, and I wish you could see all these. You don't want to see them, but all the models that go into this. But underneath that are some really, interesting things. I mean, for retirements, we assign a probability of retirement to every single retirement eligible person, and we assign that probability based on our experience, which is that police members about half of them retire at age 50. And then the rest kind of trickle out slowly all the way through age 65. And this is just a snippet, right? There's tables and tables of these things based on whether you're a man or a woman, and if you're active or you're disabled, and Trustee McLeod knows all about these things. But this is just to give you a sense. Whereas with fire members, they retire very, surprisingly steadily through their 50s, but they're mostly gone by 60. So there really are different behaviors in those two groups. So we apply a retirement probability to everybody who's eligible. That gives us a total number when we add them all up. And then in many years, we add a little bit of cushion to retirements based on, the nature of actuarial data is it's very long-term, but we might know that next year a particular thing is going to happen that's going to either push retirements up or down. We did not add any cushions this year because our actuarial projection for this year was 54 service retirements, and only 10 have retired so far this year. There's no way we're going to have 44 more retirements this year. So we feel like we've got enough cushion in our budget now. Of course, I say no way. And if I have to come back and tell you, guess what? 44 people retired. Hopefully not.
And you're talking the fiscal year, right?
Yeah, fiscal year, before June 30 is what I'm talking about. So that gives you a sense of kind of some of the assumptions that underlie the retirement probabilities. Now, death probabilities, again, now we assign a probability of death to every single person. So, Trustee Lehman and Trustee Hunziker, we can tell you our probability of death. Every single member, you just call me, we'll let you know what it is. We're just assigning a probability of death for the next year, because that's what we care about. Everybody's probability of death is 100%, but we just care, are you going to die within the next year? And so it sounds kind of morbid, but really we're just cold-hearted data nerds, and we just apply that to everybody and come up with a death projection. So, of course, that looks like you would expect it to look, that it goes up a lot in your 90s. But even at 100, it's kind of fun to note that you still have better odds than not of living for one more year, when you're 100. So, one more year. That's all we care about for the budget. And then there are some other assumptions down below that are not really actuarial assumptions, but are important. I would point out that we assume in our pension modeling that everybody retires with 27 pay dates. Because we are still trying to get enough experience under our belt to be confident with that. In the meantime, we're being conservative, but really it's been about 2/3 of folks are retiring with the 27 pay dates. And about 80% are married and have a surviving spouse, and about 80% choose the 25% survivor benefit. There are all these pieces that go into that. But I thought it'd be fun to nerd out a little bit for you there, so you can see some of those. Milliman is going to do a new experience study. In fact, we're getting going on it right now. So probably in September or November, they'll come back with a new experience study. We'll present it to the board and see how some of these assumptions have changed. Anecdotally, it feels like some of them have. So it'll be interesting to see what the data actually shows. Moving on to the next big part of the budget, the second largest part of the budget, which is PERS contributions. So a reminder that this is about 13% of the total budget. It's growing quickly, just as you would expect. We are forecasting that next year will be the tipping point where just a slight majority of the SORN workforce are PERS members. We think about 51% will be in FPDR3 next year. So it's growing 17% for next year, the costs of PERS contributions. And under that, it's kind of interesting to see that police's expenses are growing more quickly than fire's. Police expenses will be about 20% higher next year, PERS costs, and fire's PERS costs will be about 13% more, but that's just the higher turnover rate at police. Just more folks are retiring at police, they're hiring more folks, so we're seeing that switch to the majority FPDR3 more quickly at police than we are at fire. So as much as 17% is, and it's nothing to sneeze at, it's not as high as it was last year when it was almost double that, the growth, and that's because PERS contribution rates are not increasing next year. So just a reminder that they increase biannually. And I suppose it's possible they could decrease biannually, but it's been so long since that happened that it doesn't even seem possible anymore. So those increase every other year. So there's kind of that bumpiness in that cost curve, which you can a little bit see in the graph. Down at the bottom of the slide, I do talk about PERS rates, what they are for next year, 29.16%, and then what we project them to go up to. I do want to pause and point out that that projection does not include the cost-saving reforms that the 2019 Oregon legislature enacted, and it does not include the very good 2019 investment returns that PERS had. And that is because citywide, the guidance from the budget office and the mayor was not to include those for now. They want to get through the litigation at the Oregon Supreme Court on the PERS reforms, and then get good guidance from the PERS actuaries about what those rates are going to look like.
This is great, thanks. Do you have any sense of what the funded percent or unfunded liability is roughly for this PERS tier? I'm just curious whether or not there's any, certainly for the earlier PERS tiers in which there are no plan members for FPDR, but just curious whether their projections for funding are stable enough, or is it an unfunded liability being created that at some point might require or suggest some additional contributions over what they're forecasting?
Well, and that, I know a little about this, and I don't know what the liability is for this particular tier, which would be the tier 3 within PERS, the OPSRP sworn specifically. I don't know what the liability is, but I think they're unfunded. Their funded percent is in the 70 to 80% range overall. Part of one concern is that one of the reforms that they enacted in 2019 was to shorten the amortization period for the unfunded liability. And they had different amortization periods for all the different tiers and types, but I think kind of on average, they shortened it to 22 years. And it had been, it had been 22 and they lengthened it to 30 years. So as I understand it, what that did was really not, put in that the contribution rates will necessarily be higher than forecast in the future, but that they will stay higher for longer in the future. So that is what they did. I mean, it's very similar to refinancing your mortgage in that sense.
Okay.
But I think that kind of exhausts my detailed knowledge of PERS and their funded status. And the way they set contribution rates is really very interesting in that they do have this rate collaring policy where when the unfunded status of the plan drops below a certain level, they're allowed to increase rates more. But there is a limit on how much they can increase rates unless the funded status of the plan drops below, I want to say 60%, but don't quote me on that. So rates can go up a lot more dramatically if that collar comes off and the unfunded status drops. We don't see.
I'll go back and look at the last actuarial report on this, but I just couldn't recollect whether they set the contribution rates kind of collectively for the unfunded status of the plan, or if they just do it for each. I know that each tier has its own contribution rate, but I don't know if the aggressiveness in terms of the collaring, et cetera, is based on the overall funded status of the
I
plan.
believe it's based on the overall, but
Okay.
again, I don't want to say that that's for certain. I'm only 90% certain that it's set on the overall. And of course, it's set by employer as well, every employer. And then there are employer pools. So our contribution rate is specific to us at the City of Portland, but the rate is set for our pool, which is the SCLRP, the state and local government something pool. But then within that, we have some side accounts, and we've issued POBs a long time ago and bought down our contribution. And we may do some more of that, which I'll talk about in a minute.
Okay.
So everybody has a different contribution. Each employer has a different contribution rate as well, because the liability is calculated per employer.
Okay.
It's a multi-employer plan. Yeah, very interesting stuff, and especially where we start to intersect with it on these PERS contribution rates. So there is this, I mean, this is one area of the budget where there is an upside risk, by which I mean there is, a good risk that will be wrong, but in the right direction being towards lower costs. Because if those reforms are upheld, if 2019 investment returns are able to hold down contribution rate growth in the future, I mean, I think there's a decent chance that those projected PERS rates will be lower than 34% and 38%. So nice to have an upside risk in the forecast. But circling back to wages a little bit too, I want to just remind everyone that the Fpdr 3s, this is an immature population, by which I don't mean that they're running around behaving like teenagers. Maybe they are. But just that they are just now starting to spread through the ranks. So a large number of them are not topped out as police officers or firefighters, and that does take 8 years at the police bureau and 5 at fire. So they're moving, in addition to having cost of living adjustments and sometimes these additional wage increases, they're also moving through the steps of police officer and firefighter, a larger number of them than in the general population at police and fire. And now they're also starting to spread through the ranks. They're also starting to get promoted and move into specialty pay assignments. And so all of those things mean more rapid wage growth in this pool than in the entire police bureau or the entire fire bureau. Also a good time to remind everyone that wage increases hit this part of the budget harder and faster than anywhere else. Because in the Fpdr pension budget, wage increases kind of trickle in because everybody, as they retire, they have higher final pay, and so we pay them more pensions. But here, if the city increases wages tomorrow, our PERS contributions go up tomorrow. So it's an immediate full impact in this budget, wage increases. So that will matter as it gets to be a bigger and bigger part of our budget.
I'm going to go back to my earlier questions just to put it in context. When the Tier 3 FPDR contributions are a lower percentage of the overall budget, I'm not overly concerned about how well the PERS actuaries' contribution rates and assumptions, bear up over time. Mm-hmm. But as it becomes an increasing part of this budget, I think monitoring to make sure, this is happening to pension systems around the country. So to the extent that the actuaries' assumptions are, softened to some extent to help, keep contribution rates palatable for other agencies, what can happen is that the contribution levels can be
Not high enough,
understated in
yeah.
the short term and develop, as they then refine their assumptions in the future, then you end up with these losses or increases in the unfunded liability that have to be made up for the future contributions. I'd just like us to kind of keep on top of that and the unfunded percent for this tier and the contributions, so that if additional contributions should be budgeted and made sooner, so that the unfunded liability for
Yes.
this plan can remain, more stable. So I guess my question is, can you make additional contributions that are earmarked specifically for FPDR?
For
Tier
FPDR.
3?
So you are, Trustee McLeod, you should be part of the conversations we've been having over the last couple of months. So that's a very, very good point. And a really important part of what you're saying is to think about what FPDR wants to do may or may not diverge from what the city might want to do, and whether or not we can do something different. So actually, this is something I was going to talk about at the very end, but let's just pause and talk about it right now. So here's a really great example of that. So the state set up an employer incentive fund where they said, hey, if anybody out there, any employers want to buy down their liability at a faster rate, we will match your contribution by 25%, your additional contribution. It's a pretty good deal. 25% is a pretty good deal. Of course, there were a lot of rules about who got to be first in line for that. Employers with bigger unfunded liabilities got to be first in line. The city's unfunded liability wasn't big enough to be first in line. So we didn't qualify for that in the first round, but there may be additional rounds. They may put more money into it. So one of the things under discussion at the city is we would probably want to be part of that in a future round, and FPDR would have to pay a share of that because we would pay our share of the city's overall PERS contributions. So in that case, we're talking about making an additional contribution as part of the city, but we have better access to funding than the rest of the city does. And if there's a good ROI on that, for example, the contribution that's under consideration right now, the most we would probably be asked to put in would be $1.25 million, which would be part of an $8 million city contribution to PERS. But with the 25% match, and with the earnings that we would have on that, on a net present value basis, we would save at least $2 million and probably more. So that's always going to be a good deal for us if we feel like we have room in our budget to do that. We had some legal questions for Franco about whether or not we can do that. He feels that we can. We're not pre-funding the plan or doing anything like that. We're doing something that makes sense from a fiduciary point of view, and we're buying down rates. Whether or not, but in the case under discussion, that would be us playing a part in what the city is doing anyway. Whether or not we could do it individually, I don't know, and we have to explore that with PERS and with Milliman, because then they have to carve us out of the little niche we're in, because what we don't want to do is use the FPDR levy to subsidize the rest of the city's unfunded liability. And I don't know yet if that's possible. But it's a great thing to think about going forward. And we may have more opportunities to buy down rates than the city as a whole. And it might be something that we want to think about doing.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm reassured to know that you're looking out there for that opportunities to do it. But that's leveraged contributions anyway, so that does make financial sense. But just that you're keeping your eye on what those rates and future rates may be, because again, differences between current assumptions and future experience can really start to widen that unfunded liability. And I'd hate to see, this program kind of get in some difficult times as this becomes an increasing part of the budget. So,
And
thank you.
definitely, anybody can read in the paper and see how politicized, PERS contribution rates are, and like you said, around the country, and the enormous pressure on actuaries to hold contribution rates low. And it often makes sense to think to yourself whether or not this is a real contribution rate, and whether or not we really should be kicking in more. Or not. And then for us, the second question, can we kick in more separately from the city? And the reason this first came up was when that employer incentive fund was first put out there. And I thought, I don't know if the city wants to do that, but I sure do. And could we do that separately? Well, luckily the city wants to do it as well. Or we think they do. They're thinking about it. The finance people certainly do. It's one thing to get the finance people to do it, and another thing to get the politicians to allocate the budget. Great questions, great conversation. Is there anything else on PERS contributions? All right. Next big component of our budget is, it's not big, but it's the third largest is disability benefits. So just as a reminder, this is 4% of our total budget, so not a lot in terms of financial impact. And I have way too many things going on this slide, so let me orient you. There's the chart on the left that you've seen lots of times, which going along horizontally again is years, actual spending last year, projected spending this year, budgeted spending next year, and then so on through the forecast. And then dollars and millions on the y-axis. And then the different colored lines are just the different flavors of disability benefits, the different kinds of disability benefits. So if you think, if you just take medical benefits, which is the little orange kind of starburst, and combine it with wage replacement benefits for members who can't work while they're on disability, which for short-term disability is the green squares, and for long-term disability is the red triangles. Those are the big players, wage replacement and medical. If you combine those three lines, that's 93% of disability costs. Medical is a little bit larger than wage replacement. It's also faster growing because the inflation factor we apply to it, because medical inflation is higher than wage inflation. And it's also a little bit more volatile. In some years, large claims are half of our medical costs, and in some years, they're only 10% of our medical costs. And it's just the nature of that business. So it's the biggest, it's the most volatile, and it's growing the fastest in sum for the medical side. For wage replacement, if everything stayed the same, exactly the same, it would just go up the 2.9% of COLA. But for short-term disability, the green square, we always build in a little bit of cushion for incidents of disability, duration, what if disabilities last longer, pay rates, what if higher compensated folks are disabled. And also this year, short-term disability is running a little bit, quite a bit higher than last year's short-term disability. It's about 20% higher, which is probably just the standard volatility in disability, but it makes budget people super nervous. So we built in a little bit more cushion there. Now for long-term disability, for wage replacement for those folks, that is actually declining. They're still experiencing wage growth, but more and more, we only have 30 people on long-term disability right now. And they are increasingly moving to the pension plan. So 26 of them will move to pension by July 1. We'll be down to 26 by July 1. 4 of them will move to pension by July 1. And we'll be down to 20 by the end of this 5-year forecast period. So that population is getting smaller. Now, we have not budgeted for new people to join long-term disability, and surely some will. Our actuarial assumption here is that 2.58 people will join the rolls every year, but our actual experience for the last 5 years has been more like 1 every other year. So we haven't budgeted for that as we're having such a low incidence of people joining long-term disability. And if we have 1 or 2, the cost is not significant enough that we really need to make room for it in the budget. But it is declining and has been for many years. And then kind of bouncing down along the bottom in the orange circles and what are those purple squares, are return to work subsidies. Those are the wage subsidies we pay to police and fire when they put folks on modified duty just on a transitional basis. And that's relatively small and relatively stable. And then funeral benefits, which are small and actually growing. You just can't really tell because they're so little. Because the Fpdr2 funeral benefit is much more generous than the Fpdr1 funeral benefit. So as we have more Fpdr2 deaths, that funeral benefit part will grow, but it will always be small. Any questions about next year's disability budget? Before we move on to administration, running the plan. So reminder, this is less than 2% of the budget. Thinking we always try to keep administrative expenses low. Administrative expenses as a percent of bureau expenses, we expect to be about 1.6% next year, down from 1.7% last year. But as we've discussed, our expenses are growing so much that much of that drop is just our total expenses growing rather than administrative expenses doing anything in particular. Per participant, we expect administrative spending to be $741 per participant next year, which is pretty level with the $745 per participant this year. But again, part of that is we expect to have a few more participants next year. We expect to have more retirees and fewer deaths. So if, maybe a better way to just think about it is that administrative spending is going up about 2.65% for next year over what we expect to spend this year, which is very close to inflation. And this pie chart looks very similar to how it looked last year. It's about 2/3 personnel, and the rest of it is stuff we got to buy. It's mostly office rent and professional services. And let's talk in a little bit more detail about some of those things, but I also want to point out that in your forecast document, which is that longer report, on page 10, there is a line item detail of everything that we spent on administration last year, what we project we're going to spend this year, and what we're proposing to budget for next year, if you want to see all of the detail. But just to hit the highlights, in personnel, we have 17 positions, so we're a very small bureau. Sam controls the number of positions and the job classifications of the positions, but beyond that, we don't control much. The city compensation plan controls wages and cost of living adjustments and health insurance benefits, and PERS rates are set externally, as we've just been discussing. So there's not a lot that's discretionary within, given the number of positions and the job classifications. I do want to pause in case any of you have heard about this. The mayor issued updated budget guidance last week, which is really unusual. All the city bureaus get budget guidance in December about what they're supposed to turn in and what's going to happen next year. But we all got a memo last week on Wednesday with revised guidance telling us to submit budgets with lower raises for non-represented staff, and most of Fpdr is non-represented staff. So the mayor's proposal is to not give 2.9% COLA, to give less than that to folks making more than $100,000 a year, and to cap any merit raises that non-reps might be eligible for at 2% instead of the usual cap, which is 4.1%. So if you've heard about that, this budget does comply with that. We reran the numbers and turned it in like that. And as always, we'll see how things shake out as it moves through council. External materials and services, that is, stuff we buy from other places outside the city. The largest item is our office lease, since we're in private space, which is quite a bit cheaper than the space we would have if we were in the Portland building. That's about $230,000 a year. And then also, nothing else is as much as that, but other bigger items are professional services like our actuaries, our financial audit, the software programmers who keep our database programmed and running, things like that. And that is external materials and services essentially growing with inflation. Internal materials and services is what we buy from other city bureaus. The biggest things are the city attorney's office and technology services. It's going up by a little bit more than inflation, and that is mostly, not entirely, but mostly rent increases for those bureaus. They mostly live in the Portland building, and even if they don't, the city has implemented a new blended lease rate for the downtown properties. We are not part of it, so it doesn't impact us directly, but it does impact us indirectly because, of course, they're going to pass those costs on to their quote-unquote customers. So it's driving costs up a little bit there. So again, as I mentioned, there's line item detail on page 10 if the board wants to look at that, and if anyone has any questions about specific items within administrative spending. Last, I want to talk about the costs of maintaining the fund, and I talk about this every year. I don't know if I've quite put it this way before, but bureaus that have their own funds, like Fpdr, and by that I mean we don't live in the general fund. Parks and police and fire and all those folks live in the general fund. We live in our own fund, which means we have some costs. We have costs associated with maintaining our own fund. We also get money because we get interest income on our own fund. But these are the costs of maintaining our own fund. So first is we got to maintain fund contingency, because the general fund is not going to bail us out if something comes up and we don't have enough money. There's an unanticipated expense or we undercollect on revenues. The general fund will say, that sounds like a personal problem, and you will figure it out, I'm sure, Stacy. So fund contingency, we've got to maintain that ourselves. But we also have to manage our own cash flow, which, since our revenue, almost our only revenue source, not our only, but vast majority of our revenues come from property taxes. That means we're issuing the tax anticipation notes every year. But as I said, we do get interest income, and we get to keep our interest income, and that more than offsets the cost of the tax anticipation notes every year. And we also have to pay something called general fund overhead, which is where all the other funds in the city pay for costs, citywide costs that live in the general fund, and that's things like city council offices, citywide emergency management, human resources, things like that. So we have to pay general fund overhead. So most of those things, like a lot of our budget, kind of are what they are, and we're just trying to do our best to figure out what they're going to be. But contingency is an active decision that we make every year and think a lot about, and that is the bar chart at the top of this slide that shows contingency both as a percent of total Bureau spending or budget and in a dollar amount running along the y-axis for the last 3 fiscal years that we have actuals for, and then what we plan to budget contingency at next year for fiscal year in '21, and then where we think we'll be going forward. So what you can see is that it has been, and we plan to keep it in that 6 to 7% range. But as expenses go up, that's a bigger and bigger number. And a few years ago, that was $8 million. Next year, we're proposing to put $11.5 million in fund contingency because our expenses are getting bigger. So 7% of a bigger number is a bigger number. But we do vary contingency every year based on the risks that we think we face in any given year. And the main risks are that tax revenue will fall short because we have miscalculated compression, discounts, delinquencies, and I'll talk more about that when we talk about revenues. That we have fewer retirements, no, the other way around, more retirements or fewer deaths than we have projected. In some years, labor contracts are a risk. They're a notable risk this year. In some years, there are legal risks where we have the possibility of a legal payout. We have a little bit of that risk this year, but not much. So every year we think about, all right, what's the risk level and what do we need to put in fund contingency? At the same time, if we don't spend fund contingency, it falls to fund balance and we have to raise less in property taxes the next year. So the cost of having too large of a contingency is really just the burden on having asked the taxpayers for too much money, which we don't want to do. But so the $11.5 million that we propose to budget in contingency this year is enough, we think, to cover our main risks. It's enough that if our property tax losses, which we estimate are going to be 9.5%, that we're going to lose to compression and discounts and delinquencies, well, we could lose 16.5% with this $11.5 million. $11.5 million is enough to cover 1 month of pension payments, which just feels nice from a cash flow perspective. It's enough to cover significant above cost of living wage increases or more hiring if that falls out of labor contracts. It's enough to cover some more retirements or fewer deaths. But it is not enough to cover all of those things at once. So if we had the perfect hurricane and all of those things happened at one time, $11.5 million would not be enough. And in that case, it wouldn't be a crisis. We would need to borrow money, and we would borrow money from another city fund probably and have to pay the prevailing interest rate, which is mostly a lot of paperwork and shame. Shame for me having to call another fund and ask to borrow money. But $11.5 million we feel is a comfortable level of contingency for next year without being excessive, we hope. So we've been talking about expenditures and some of the assumptions, and I think it's kind of nice to stop and talk about assumptions holistically. And I also must have wanted to design like an abstract modern art slide or something, because that's kind of what this looks like. I got a little crazy with the colors. But these are really all of the assumptions that go into building the expenditure budget in one place. And I put wage increases in red right in the middle because they hit every part of the budget. And I just wanted everybody to see that. So the pieces of our budget are kind of the 4 circles around the edges: pension costs, PERS contributions, disability costs, and administrative costs. And you can see what impacts pension costs. Well, retirement and death rates, 27 paid 8 take up, how many people get 27 paid 8s, the cost of living adjustments you all give to the Fpdr 2 folks, but also wage increases because that's the COLA for Fpdr 1s, and it increases Fpdr 2 costs for everybody who retires after the wage increase. If you circle over to PERS contributions, PERS contribution rates obviously affect that, but what affects PERS contribution rates? Well, investment returns and any reform that's made to the plan. But police and fire hiring rates also affect PERS contribution. The faster they hire, the faster those costs increase. Down in disability, but wage increases also affect PERS contributions because obviously if we're paying our PERS covered members more, we will pay more in PERS contributions. Down in disability costs, there are a lot of factors there too. We have medical inflation and frequency and severity and duration of disabilities, but also wage increases, because when we're paying time loss, when we're paying wage replacement, if people are making more money, that costs more money. And then even administrative costs, which are also impacted by inflation in all the non-personnel categories and the non-wage portions of the personnel budget. But wage increases are impacting our personnel budget as well. So wage increases are the one place that touch everything, which is why not having settled labor contracts makes me get a little nervous. But it's kind of nice, I think, to be able to see all of the assumptions that are in play with the expenditure budget in one place and a little bit how they interact. The next slide has a table where I give you values for a lot of these assumptions. If you're interested in digging into what specifically are we assuming, I show them for the current year, for the budget year, fiscal year in '21, and then for the 5 years of the forecast. Some of these are actuals rather than assumptions. For example, in fiscal year in '20, those PERS rates are the rates. They are also the rates for fiscal year in '21 since they're set biannually. The pension COLAs, those are the pension COLAs for fiscal year in '20. Those aren't assumptions, those are real. So some of these are real and some of these are projected, but if you wanted to have a closer look at what we are assuming, some of these are assumptions we develop internally. Some of them come from the city economist, who is also Chair Harwood. So he's also another great person to ask if you have questions about details of these. As I've already mentioned, the PERS rates in the out years don't include some factors that may reduce the growth in future years, we're hoping. And then just noting along the bottom, we were talking about aggressive police hiring. So if you look at the very bottom line of that table, these are our hiring assumptions for police and fire. And like I said, it's a negotiated thing because our budgets have to match. But with police, we've got them hiring 70 to 80 folks a year for 4 years in a row. And the most that police has ever hired before now is 34 in 1 year. However, they have hired 39 so far this year. And the key is to hire them and keep them. And so, hire them and then a certain percent wash out. And of course, that happens in fire as well. But so this is a hiring rate that greatly exceeds what we have seen from police before. So that's another upside risk in the forecast. If they don't hire that quickly, our costs will not be as high. So we always want to talk about risks when we're talking about budget. This is a slide that just lists the most significant, and risk to a financial person, it's the risk that I'm wrong, and I could be wrong in a good direction or a bad direction. So upside risks are things where I think if we're wrong, it's more likely that we're wrong in a way that reduces costs. And that's the PERS contribution rates and the police bureau hiring. Downside risks are, well, if we're wrong in a way that probably increases costs, and those are mostly around the labor contracts. But also, as I think you know, PFFA and PPCOA have filed a grievance alleging that non-represented employees should get 27 pay dates in their pension calculations. So that is our only kind of legal risk, significant legal risk, and even that is not significant financially because we don't have a lot of non-represented staff. But that arbitration is scheduled for February, and if we are paying if that doesn't turn out and we're paying retros, then that's kind of another downside risk. And everything else, those are just a bunch of other assumptions that could go either way. They could be higher or lower than we forecast, and that would make expenses be more or less. Oof. All right, that's it for expenses. You guys still have the energy to talk about revenues? They're kind of looking like, do we have a choice? All right, revenues does not take quite as long. And it's kind of unusual to talk about expenses and then revenues. Usually, I hope when you're doing your home budget, you think about how much money you have and then what you're going to spend it on. But here we think about how much money do we need, and then how are we going to make our revenues match what we need, because we have to pay these benefits. So this is a chart that shows all of our revenues. You can see that almost all of it is blue, which means almost all of it is property taxes, 89%. Beginning fund balance is in orange. At 9% for next year, we project we're going to have about $17 million in beginning fund balance next year. And when you consider that that's really just leftover property taxes from prior years, then really property taxes are about 98% of our revenues. And then we are just getting little slivers, mostly from interagency revenue, which I'll explain in a minute, and interest income. And this also looks very similar to how it looked in past years. So let's take a look at property taxes, because this is where it all is, since this is 98% of our revenues. Figuring out what we need is really almost funnily straightforward. Once we've figured out all the expenditure pieces, and we take out our other revenues and beginning fund balance, that's what we need in property taxes. So we're estimating that we need about $166 million next year in fiscal year in '21. But remember, if you see a higher number at some point, council needs to levy more than that, because we think we're going to lose about 9.5% of our levy to compression, delinquencies, and discounts. So they will be levying something more like 180 million-ish. And since expenses have to be funded almost exclusively with tax revenues, it makes sense that taxes need to grow at about the same rate as expenses. But as I mentioned in the very beginning, they're not growing. They're growing about 6% for next year, property taxes. But they only need to grow 6% despite expenditure growth of 7.2% because of that little bit extra in beginning fund balance. And then I also wanted to drop onto this slide just kind of a preview of tax rates over this forecast period. So built into these, the current rates are the current rates. Those are real. But for next year, and then I also put them in the last year of the forecast so you could see how we expect them to grow over the 5 years. And so behind those rates are all of our assumptions about our budget and how much money we need, and all of our assumptions about what's going to happen with real market value growth and assessed value growth. So there's a lot of assumptions built into that, but it gives you a sense of how both of those rates are growing over the forecast period we're talking about right now. Other revenue. So again, kind of a lot going on this slide, but another reminder, this is only 2% of our revenue. But of that 2%, 75% of that 2%, 75% of that 3.7 million in other revenue comes from two places. One of those is interagency revenue from the police bureau, which is charges the police bureau assesses when they do contract work for other agencies, which is mostly TriMet, but they do contract work for a lot of different places. TriMet's just the biggest chunk. And when they do that, that third party will pay the wages and the benefits of the police officers plus an overhead rate, and we get part of that overhead rate. So that's what the interagency revenue is in blue on that chart. And then on that chart in yellow is the other main source of other revenue, which is interest income. So interest income, we do expect to be flat for next year because we do expect our fund balance to go up. Our fund balance is going up every year as we levy more and more taxes to pay for more and more expenses. We've had an average daily balance of about 61.6 million in our fund this year, and we think that's going to go up to almost 68 million next year. So we sit on a little more cash as our expenses grow. But interest rates we expect to decline. And we are mostly relying on the city investment officer for those rates, but we do expect them to drop next year and then drop again the year after that. But because our fund balance is growing, it's keeping us level next year and then actually growing in future years, even with interest rates having dropped. So if interest rates ever do rebound and start to grow in combination with the growing fund balance, as we have to just collect more property tax revenue, interest income will tick up if interest rates recover, as it seems like they must eventually do, but perhaps not. Any questions about other revenue? We also have other very minor revenues, but those are the two main other revenues. And just like with expenditures, I just wanted to show you a chart of some of the major assumptions that go into the revenue budget. Again, all the action is in that property tax table at the top, where we are making projections about RMV growth and AV growth and compression. These mostly, again, come from Chair Harwood, who's also the city economist. You can see that he does expect RMV to rebound back up to the 4% level, but still significantly below historic rates, and that he expects AV to settle back down. Still be above the 3% for new construction, but to settle back down from where it was. And then he's expecting compression, discounts, and delinquencies to kind of stay the same throughout the forecast period. In the table on interest income assumptions, You can see the interest rates dropping that I talked about. You can see fund balance growing, the average daily cash balance growing, as I talked about, and so interest income moving around accordingly. And some of our assumptions as we build that interagency revenue budget from police, which is actually extraordinarily complicated for such a small chunk of the budget, but we're trying to project how much third-party work police is going to do. Of course, we do this with the Police Bureau finance staff. We try to project this together and projecting what the overhead rate will be. The overhead rate that we charge, by the way, is just the OPSERP, the PERS, the same PERS contribution rate we pay on FPDR 3 members. Whether or not the police officers doing the work are FPDR 2s or 3s, we charge that. And then there's also a small 3.5% disability overhead rate, which is calculated as our rolling 3-year average of service-connected disability costs over covered payroll. So risks to revenues. I put them in 2 categories here, property taxes and other, and let me just first start out by saying that all the risks listed under other, I mean, we have enough money in contingency to lose all of our other revenues, so we don't really need to be too worried about that. If all of our other revenues disappeared tomorrow, we would still be fine. So the risk is on the property tax side. Compression is the biggest one because property tax compression is notoriously difficult to predict and very hard to understand. It requires an inside baseball knowledge of what all the other governments are doing with all of their levies and how those levies are moving. And then it requires doing all the math right, and then it requires overlaying that math properly on the city property tax map about which properties are already in compression and which properties are about to go into compression. And Chair Harwood comes up with that assumption, and he's the best in the business, but it's still pretty tough to do. So I think the biggest risk in property taxes is that we miss, in the past when we've been significantly over or under in property taxes, it's because we've missed on the compression assumption. Delinquencies also move around a lot. They move around a lot though with the sort of macroeconomic forces because when we have an economic downturn, it's harder for people to pay their property taxes. And so economists are pretty used to thinking about macroeconomics. We know how wrong they get it a lot of the time also though. So delinquencies is another risky area. Discounts, it's a lot more stable. People tend to use the discount at a much more stable rate. All right, I'm almost done. So I always want to leave you with just a couple of things that I hope you take away from this year's budget, and there is nothing earth-shattering, and we've already talked about all of these. But the first thing is just to know that we are continuing to see pension costs grow exactly as we predicted. FPDR 2 pension costs are going up as that pool of retirees gets bigger and they have higher final pay. And PERS contribution costs are getting much bigger in that biannually bumpy way. They're getting much bigger as the size of the number of people in PERS grows and their wages grow. But the second takeaway is that most other costs are stable for next year, either stable or declining. I mean, disability costs are really only growing with inflation, and long-term disability costs are going down. Administrative spending is growing only with inflation. FPDR 1 pension costs are actually declining, so that's the one piece of pension that's declining. So everything else is stable or declining for next year. And then the last piece, which we've talked about throughout the presentation, is that I do feel like there's a little more uncertainty than usual, mostly because of uncertainty around labor contracts. But there are also the future of PERS contribution rates is adding to uncertainty because we don't know what's going to happen at the Oregon Supreme Court. And we finally a little bit of uncertainty around those police bureau hiring rates. Can they hire as fast as they hope they can? I know we say that every year, and we'll see. We'll see how that shakes out. So I think those are kind of the main takeaways from the budget. And I will, before we talk about a motion to adopt, just kind of a preview of what's going to come up next year and in the out years to start, just to have it in your mind now. Again, we talked about some of this as we went along. But by the time I come back next year, we should have resolution on the PERS reform. But of course, I mean, PERS is a never-ending conversation, so there could be other new things that we're talking about in relation to PERS. But hopefully we'll get this round of reforms resolved. We should have new contracts in place for everybody, but by its nature, that's always a short-term resolution because labor contracts are usually 3 years long, sometimes longer, but so we're never gonna have complete resolution on labor contracts, but we hopefully won't have all 3 of them open at the same time. And we're going to get a new experience study from Milliman. which, like I said, are anecdotally, we feel like some things have changed, and it's always interesting to see if the data bears that out. Got to tell you, like 90% of the time it doesn't, and you're like, gosh, I thought that was going to be like this, and no, it's not. So I'm really excited to see what the experience study shows. And then just a continuation of the trends that we have been talking about. We are fortunate in that way, in that the different things can impact the speed at which those trends happen. If we hire faster or slower, have faster or slower wage growth, but nothing's going to turn the train around on any of these trends. It's just going to make them go faster or slower on things coming up. Whew. You guys have done it. You got through the whole thing. Trustee McLeod even looked like she enjoyed it. Trustee Lehman is smiling, probably because he's happy that it's over.
Put a lot into that presentation. It took a while, but there's a lot of information there. I appreciate it. You put a lot of work into that, and that's awesome. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. We do put months and months of work into trying our best to get this as right as we can. So thank you. Are there any other questions that you didn't get a chance to ask as we were going along?
I just had a question. When we get to adopting this, when we say we're adopting the budget, is it this document that we're adopting, or what is it that we're adopting?
Yeah, I mean, this document, and that's kind of why I like to throw the slide out there. But if you want, if the board has any interest in this, I can give you, it's about 100 pages long, all the different pieces of the budget that we're required to submit. I think that forecast document,
The
which.
first couple pages.
Yeah, those first 2 pages really, that's what you're adopting, are all those numbers. They're all encapsulated there. And then the forecast document has more detail on that, and then there are other sort of slices and views of the budget that we have to turn in. But yeah, really those first 2 slides are what you are adopting. And so let me talk again about adoption. We kind of say this every year, but you are adopting the budget. You're the only ones authorized to adopt the budget. But we need you to adopt it with the understanding that we may have to make minor technical changes. And that is because council will go on doing all kinds of things to the rest of the city budget, changing rates to technology services and telling police to do something and fire to do something else. And those things all intersect with our budget in different ways. And we will be required to sort of match up. But we will not make any change that was anything more than that. And the only significant change, and if anything changed that wasn't very minor and very technical, I would always, and if you want, I can even bring back the minor technical, but you will cry if you want to hear them all. They'll be like, well, we changed the laptop replacement rate to this, and things like that. But if anything significant changes, I will always bring that back at the May meeting, because the mayor will propose the budget. We'll have proposed the budget by then, and I'll at least know what's under consideration. And the only significant thing I can think of that is not in this budget is the potential to make that contribution, the PERS contribution, to get employer incentive matching funds. But that is dependent right now on the rest of the city being willing to do that, and that requires the general fund to come up with like $1.5 million for their share. And but all the fund managers, we've all met and talked, and the unknown piece is the general fund piece. Everyone else can come up with the money and wants to do it naturally because it's got a great savings. And it also depends on us being eligible, to get that match right now. So that's the only significant thing I can see coming up after adoption. But there are probably many, many things that I can't foresee that could come up.
Any more questions from the board?
None for me.
Anybody sign up to speak on this? Not at all. Okay. So I think I would entertain a motion.
I'll move that we adopt the budget as presented to us.
Second.
And motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And please don't hesitate to contact me with any questions that you think of later.
Thank you.
All right. So action item number 2, resolution 527. Sam?
Yeah, 527 and 528, I'm going to talk about both of those, so that's action item 2 and 3. If you remember last board meeting, we asked you, thank you, Kim. Yep. We asked you to increase the cap to MHN, one of our MCOs, so we could continue to reap the savings that they provide to us. As a normal procedure, anytime there's a change to a contract, it must go through the city procurement office, who makes sure the contract's all done correctly and the city of Portland approves what's doing. Interestingly, the person who did it, as they were doing it, found an issue with the original contract drafted in 2009. So it has an impact on what we're doing. So let me give you a little bit of background here. The city, when you write a contract, you go through an RFP process, you can write the contract up to 5 years in length. At the end of the 5-year mark, you may extend that contract without an RFP another 5 years. Of course, you can change the rates with it, but essentially it's the same contract and maybe some rate adjustments going for, so you can have a maximum 10-year contract. The contract that was effective January 2010 was a 6-year contract. Somebody messed up and allowed that one to be 6 years. Then in 2015, we extended it 5 years, which made it an 11-year contract. So the 10th year ended December 31, 2019, so it has ended. So per the city, both our MCO contracts, the second one is with Kaiser Foundation, are expired as of December 31. It was a big issue. It caught us all off guard. Even procurement's the one who signed off and helped draft the original one. So everybody who's been involved with this, it was done wrong to begin with and was never caught as we've looked at these contracts multiple times over the past 11 years or 10 years. So procurement, after I raised a big stink, and I want to thank Franco to help out a lot, came up with a solution for us. They're going to allow us to draft a 2-year contract with both Kaiser and MHN. It's essentially the same contract that we have, so there'll be no change in scope of work. There might be some adjustments in the pay, but we don't, I mean, in the fees. We don't think there will be, but there might be, but we'll extend the same fee agreement. And we have for the MHN contract a not to exceed amount of $250,000, and under Resolution 528 for Kaiser, it's not to exceed $30,000 over those 2-year period. Our intent was always that this contract was going to end on December 20th of this year. So in July, we were going to do a full RFP to continue it. With this 2-year contract written, the full RFP will start in July of 2021, and we will then look to, do we have one or two? Well, probably we'd like to have 2, maybe 3 managed care organizations participate in the RFP process, and if we could possibly select 2 or 3, like we selected 2, but that's the process that will start next year. So the beauty of it is that they're already beginning to write the contracts. It's going through procurement. We just do not have the draft done. I want to thank Kim because she's been working hard with getting these detailed and brought across. So what we're looking here, because we need to get these approved as soon as possible, because we can't wait till the March board meeting or we won't be able to pay bills or enter into a contract for 3 months, is that you give me the authority to continue to have these contracts drafted. They'll be drafted to mirror the existing contract, no changes in scope. You've got the not to exceed amount against 2 years, January 1 of 2020 through December 31 of 2021. So that's what we're asking. I'm asking here for both these two is that you give me permission to finish and negotiate that with it. So again, there's no change in the contract. We're not asking for more services. The fees that we're using, the not to exceed amounts are in line with the fees, same fee schedules or cost schedules that we've had in the contract for the last 5 years.
Okay, so again, just the fee amounts over the 2-year period are roughly, though not maybe precisely,
Yeah.
equal to the equivalent of the 1-year contract that we thought we extended before?
Yes.
Okay.
With that.
And so I thought you said you're going to send RFPs out this summer.
Well, okay, under the old thing, when we thought this 10-year, which you now find out 11-year contract would have been up, we were predicting it was going to be expiring 12/31 of 2020 at the end of this year. So we would have started the RFP process in summer, at least 6 months in lead time, so we could go out, select, and have a new contract available on 1/1/21. But we just found out that, no, this contract it expired a month ago. So we're working officially without a contract with our 2 vendors. So they came in and they say, we can write a 2-year contract so we can get you back to 1/1/20 and go for 2 years instead of the 1. They just felt, let's get it good for 2 full year, and we can then do the RFP 6 months before the 2-year expires.
So the RFP will go out in 2020.
2021 July, so it'll be 6 months.
2021.
So yeah,
Okay.
6 months before it expires, we will start the RFP process. And then we will come back and talk with you what that process is, and as we've done in the past, we'll offer a chance for a board member and maybe sit on one of the evaluation committees with that RFP if you so like. But again, we'll be back in a year. So I apologize, we don't have the contracts, but we just learned about this, about 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago. So again, Kim for working hard with procurement, and then Franco advocating for us on finding this way to develop this 2-year contract so we are not without MCO coverage.
Okay, and do you think we need 2 different motions, or can we do these
Well,
both within one?
I think you could do one, saying you're going to approve both resolutions,
Okay.
527 and 528.
Okay.
Kathy's nodding her head, so yes.
Anybody want to speak on this? No? All right. Any more questions?
Oh, go ahead. Somebody
Go
else.
ahead, I'll let you go first, please.
I think we're going towards the motion, so if you got something before.
Actually, no, I don't have any questions. I'm good.
Okay.
Okay. I'll entertain a motion for Resolution 527 and 528.
And I'm going to make that motion that we approve them both.
Okay, got a motion?
I second.
And a second. So the votes for approving Resolution 527 and 528. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries for both.
Thank you very much for that. That caught us all off guard really bad, didn't they?
All right, I think we've made it to information items, unless there was something.
Do you want to hear
Listen
from
there.
Stacy again? You're the first one
Yeah.
up. The first information item is the expenses by month.
I'm sure you don't want to hear me again. Hear from me again. There's not much to report them. We do have a half a year of expenses under our belt at this point. And really the only thing that's kind of interesting, but it happens every year, is if you look down at miscellaneous sources under revenues, you'll see how we finally start to get some real interest in December because we finally get our property taxes and are sitting on some actual cash. And then payments out to police and fire for PERS contributions, because police and fire make those contributions in the payroll system, and then we reimburse them. So those lag based on when they actually bill us, and so those are lagging out a bit, but that's also not unusual that they take a couple months to bill us for those, and we're happy to sit on the cash if they don't want it. But yeah, those are really the only things of note in the expenditure report.
How many times a year do they send you the bill?
Quarterly.
Quarterly.
They do bill us
four times.
quarterly. And again, I don't want to make, it's in our interest to sit on the cash as long as we can. I should probably only say that while Chair Harwood is not here, since he cares about the general fund. But at some point, as that turns into a larger and larger number, what really might make sense in the long run is to find a way for them to hit our fund automatically in the system. But they can't figure that out right now in the SAP programming. And so I have to have one of my financial analysts, they send a bill and she goes through it and makes sure everybody on there is legit. And we're not paying for people we shouldn't be paying for. And it's kind of a labor-intensive process. So doing it every month would be a bit painful, but we may need to move to that as this gets bigger.
Do you track any of that, or do you just get the bill and you pay it? I mean, are you involved in the?
Oh, I mean, I don't, but someone who works for me does.
Okay.
In excruciating detail. And in fact, I think the PFFA office called asking for some detail on a few folks who are, oh boy, I can't even remember now. But I mean, we have that detail if you guys ever need that. Yeah, we have a lot of, we have all the detail.
Okay,
Every single person.
thank you. Okay, moving on to legislative updates.
Legislative updates. Okay, try to see if I can make this fast. We do want to review one of the bills that's coming through. So this is the Oregon Legislative short session this year. It lasts from February 3rd through March 8th. It's up to 35 days, assuming they go the full length of that session. The bills were formally made public yesterday, so some of them are 256 are released what they call pre-session. I've gone through them, and Government Relations for the City of Portland is going through them. They'll identify the bills that are of interest to Fpdr, and I'll do the same thing, and we'll follow those. However, I've taken the pre-look through it, and There appear to be no significant PERS bills. Actually, I only found 2 this morning, and they're both very minor and have absolutely nothing to do with FPDNR in any way. And there's only one workers' compensation bill, which is the one I will go over with you today. Other than that, there's nothing there. I typically at this session would not expect to see it for a couple reasons. Nobody's going to introduce any PERS changes until the litigation is resolved on PERS. And then depending upon how the resolution goes, you might start seeing more PERS bills or other action happening. And again, with workers' comp, they just don't tend to try to put workers' comp stuff through in a short session because they have such big items: homelessness, housing, mental health, gun control, legislative or campaign expenses, cap and trade. So that's where they're going to be putting their attention on with it. There are some initiatives that were put out there, and I've been watching those that'll come up in the November election. All 5 PERS initiatives have been withdrawn. Former Governor Kulongoski had put together 5 different, and he pulled it primarily because everybody's on the wait and see for the court cases on the last year's PERS. Initiative 13, which impacts PERS, is the one that you cannot have any future unfunded balances, which is huge impact to PERS and would be big impact FPDNR, our Plan 2, Fpdr 2 plan. They've gotten it approved to gather signatures. I'm not seeing any movement that they are starting that signature gathering process. There were hints that they are also going to park that for the year and not proceed with it because there wasn't the political interest to do that. But I'll keep watching that because these things can also, the snap of your fingers, just take off running with it. So I want to go over the one workers' compensation bill that's been presented. I sent you an email with some documents. Do you have those documents with you? If not, Kathy's got some extras that we can. And for the audience, we had put some out there.
Do you need it?
Okay.
Could I get a second one? Yeah.
Okay. I did have a cover email that I sent you, and I said PFFA had sponsored this. No, it's Oregon Firefighters Association, which Jason reminded me today. So it's not PFFA. Problem is Alan Ferschweiler is the president for PFFA and is an officer in the other one, so I get mixed up when I see his name popping up on things. So I apologize. So I get that clarified.
Firefighters are members of the Oregon
Yeah.
State Firefighters,
But they are the ones that are putting their names on the sponsorship for the bill. Okay, so the first thing I want to look is at the main bill itself, which your copy says draft. It just came out. It is now House Bill 4062, and Representative Solman is the one who's sponsoring it through. So it's the exact same wording, so there was no change between the draft and the coming of the introduction of the bill. What I want to take a quick look is, so you've got this one that says draft. That's the full bill. If you look at page 3 of that bill, you will see an area that's either highlighted in yellow or gray, depending upon how you printed it. It starts with 4A on that. What they're looking to do on this is to have a certain set of presumptions that are in this workers' compensation statutes today and have them apply to FPDNR. So under 4A here, that's part of the Oregon Workers' Compensation statute. It's been there for quite a while. They now want it to apply to FPDNR. So I highlighted the statute. Again, that they're not changing the statute, they're not adding to it. But if you look at Part B below, it's in bold. All that wording there is their fancy way of saying this applies to FPDNR. It's the same wording that was used in the PTSD bill, making it apply to FPDNR. So there's no problem with that wording. It's the same wording as before. So this makes this a very simple bill, because like I said, they've got big things on the legislature this year. Will they even entertain this bill? Because they have one option, not even to assign it to committee and just leave it stacked on corner of somebody's desk, or the speaker's desk actually, or it could go through, and because it's so simple and applies to only one area, that it could go through and just slide really right through the legislature quickly. So it's either going to be one or the other. Because again, they're not making any changes to the workers' compensation statute except saying, FPDR, you've got to follow this particular provision. So we can go down here because I want to show you, I'm going to walk through this bill here in a minute. I'm going to compare it to, and you have one thing, it starts Portland City Charter, Section 5306. This is FPDR's disability plans presumptions. We do have presumptions in the FPDR plan. This is what they are. I'm not going to read it to you because you'll see in a minute how I compare it to the other one. But that's just for your reading. After you finish rereading all the budget documents, you can reread that one page. Okay, so the next one here, and I'm going to see if I can get this up here. Okay, where are we going here? No, it's not giving me what I want. Okay. Okay, you want to flip that over? Again, this is a copy of the handout you have. It looks a little bit small on the screen, but I just had it up there. So what I want to do is compare the workers' compensation, the 656802 Part 4A, which I'm just going to call the Workers' Compensation Statute for short, to the FPDR plan, which is the 5306D with it. Interestingly, they're both written somewhat the same. So line by line, you can compare them across, and that's what I'm trying to do here. The Workers' Compensation Statute, specifically 4A, was passed in 1990 and made part of the Workers' Compensation Statute, so 30 years ago. 5306D was amended to the charter as part of the big charter change in 1990. So they both have been around 30 years with that. So the Workers' Compensation Statute has 4 sentences. I'm going to go through each sentence by itself and compare it to the similar sentence in the FPDR plan. And the first sentence is packed with a lot of information, so I tried to summarize it down here in the bullet points down below. First of all, the Workers' Compensation Statute only covers firefighters. Does not cover police, and that's the way it's been for 30 years. If you look over at the FPDR presumptions, they cover firefighters and police officers. They cover all our members. So there's the one difference between it. Part 2 is going to indicate one of the big reasons why this is popular and being sponsored by the Oregon Firefighters Association. It's the conditions that are that this bill applies to, or this section of the statute applies to. And Nelson, I've asked Nelson Hall to come up after me. He can explain a little bit more of some of the reasoning of why they're looking at the bill, so I'll let him go into more detail. So if you look at number 2A, so it's disease of lungs and respiratory tract. This is a broad range of medical conditions or medical diagnoses with it. So you're putting a lot of medical diagnoses under a presumption. If you look over at 2A and B under the Part 306, we have only 2 very specific respiratory issues that are covered under our presumption, pneumonia and tuberculosis. So again, this is one of the reasons why is the firefighters associations wanted to cover more bills with this, because all the other firefighters in the state have this coverage. FPD and our firefighters do not. So again, you're going to cover that bigger thing. 2B is hypertension. The FPDR plan does not cover hypertension as a presumption or under a presumption of any kind. So again, you're adding another diagnosis to the list. And then Part C is cardiovascular and renal disease. And you compare it to Part 2C under the FPDR plan, which is only heart disease. So heart disease, again, is a narrow definition, where when you look at cardiovascular and renal disease, it's a broader definition. So if you take a look, you're covering an awful lot of conditions under the statute, the workers' comp statute, than you are under the FPDR plan. So that's one of the draws and the wants of why the fire associations are pushing for this bill. Interestingly, under FPDR, we cover hernias, AIDS, and hepatitis B, which is not included in this statute here with it. Now, this statute does not replace 5306. It augments it or supersedes it in certain situations. So it doesn't go away, this does not go away or get rewritten or crossed out in the charter. Part 3 here for this first paragraph, it requires the employment of 5 or more years for all the conditions before you can claim any of these conditions under this under the statute. If you look at FPDRs, it's only 5 or more years for the heart disease. All the other diagnoses, there is no employment requirement. So the second sentence basically says that any condition, those noted above, are presumed to result from firefighters' employment. This is the presumption wording. The Charter, Section 5306, does not specifically use the word presumption, but it is written as a presumption, how you do it. And but if you look at a couple of the administrative rules, it does say presumption. So it is a presumption, and Franco in a minute will explain to you what a presumption is and what a presumption means. But basically, the second sentence says this statute's a presumption. By default, FPDRs is a presumption. So can you hit the return key on that, or an arrow key or something, just to move the slide one? Sure. There you go. Okay, so we're on the second page here. This is the third sentence in the statute. It says any such firefighter must have taken a physical examination on becoming a firefighter, a subsequent thereto, which failed to reveal any evidence of such condition or impairment of health which pre-existed employment. Those conditions are the ones that were described in sentence 1. That is that we have no corresponding requirement under the FPDR assumptions. So it's basically saying is you have to have some medical thing saying you didn't have this condition when you started employment or when you came in. Again, it's just trying to make sure, because when you have hypertension, a lot of people have hypertension. You can function perfectly normal and work perfectly complex jobs. What we're trying to say is you're going to have to show you don't have hypertension when you came in with this in order to claim a hypertension presumption. And the last one, I'm going to leave this to Franco to talk over the last ones when it describes the level of rebuttal needed for those. So I'll let Frank describe what the FPDR use preponderance of evidence and clear and convincing evidence is what's in the statute and what is a presumption. So I'll defer to Franco on that.
Good afternoon, Acting Chair, Layman, and trustees.
Good afternoon.
Nice to see you. Just really briefly, since this bill has not become a law yet, what we're talking about here in terms of a presumption, kind of the Black's Law Dictionary definition of presumption is, and to be clear, presumption's not a benefit. It's not something for which you are provided coverage. You've heard the word cover a lot. That's not the legal language. That's just kind of the colloquial language. But just so that there isn't a misinterpretation or misimpression about what a presumption does. But a presumption is basically an inference drawn from certain facts, which, and when it's a rebuttable presumption, which may be overcome by the introduction of contrary evidence. That's kind of the basic high-level definition of presumption. This bill, HB 4062, like the presumption that the legislature passed and imposed on the city of Portland recently in 4A of the same statute, does employ the clear and convincing evidence standard in order to rebut. So these are all rebuttable presumptions. The comparison's interesting, but it doesn't have a tremendous amount of legal significance other than perhaps if this bill becomes a law, then some of the claims that would have been subject to the presumption under Section 5306D of the Charter would instead be preempted by this law that the legislature passes, and that presumption would have to be applied by the fund administrator. The current presumptions and the big picture of presumptions and the standards of proof that apply to them under the Charter. The preponderance of the evidence standard is used, which has been defined, and the common meaning is also just the greater weight of the evidence. So in order to rebut the presumption, and in fact, the Charter says that the fund administrator shall deny a claim under these circumstances when the greater weight of the evidence weighs against a service connection. This, by contrast, the HB 4062 talks about clear and convincing evidence, which I don't know that this definition is particularly helpful to the trustees, but the courts say that rather than greater weight of the evidence, clear and convincing evidence is a standard of proof that says it is highly probable. So in this context, it'd be highly probable that one of these conditions was not service-connected, was not caused in the course and scope of employment, essentially. And in terms of the even bigger picture, the clear and convincing evidence falls somewhere between, and this is again just sort of the common thinking on this, preponderance of the evidence and the standard we're all kind of familiar with, which is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's not quite to that, the standard used in criminal cases, the proof beyond a reasonable doubt, but it is certainly a higher standard to rebut than simply preponderance of the evidence would be. If that makes sense.
See that last part again? I understood the preponderance part, but the last part, what were you saying?
The clear and convincing evidence is a higher standard because it basically has been defined as highly probable.
Okay.
Let me make sure I'm not misspeaking here. Clear and convincing is higher than preponderance. So clear and convincing is highly probable. Preponderance is a greater weight of the evidence.
And that's for the fund to deny a presumptive. They would have to have a highly probable.
In essence, for that, yes. I mean, for that, and when the rubber meets the road, if that denial's appealed that's the standard the court is going to use to decide whether that denial should stand or whether it should be overturned.
If the denial's appealed, so it's, that burden is on the member.
Well, I mean, in the same way that the burden of making a claim is on the member, the burden, exercising the right to appeal a denial, of course, would be on the member, right? But in terms of the burden of proof, what these presumptions really do is shift that to the fund for these particular conditions.
okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is kind of, without the context of a real case, this is a little bit
I'll
esoteric.
put it just a little practical. If we know that we have clear and convincing, we know that it's our responsibility to get the information to show that it's clear and convincing that this is not, that the presumption doesn't apply. We won't use anything lower for this because we know doggone well it will get overturned if it's an appeal. We want to come up with the right decision with it. And then if we do deny because we say we've come up with clear and convincing evidence, somebody appeals it, the ALJ, the review, and then if it goes all the way up into the courts, they'll all be looking and saying, in their mind, does this meet clear and convincing? If yes, they support us. If no, they say, no, Fpdr, you're wrong.
The member needs preponderance, the board, the fund would need the higher.
Well, we need the preponderance too. I mean, it's our responsibility when there's a preponderance to provide the information that is of greater weight with that. I mean, so it's always our job to go out and get the information to compare it to what it is, but it's the comparison. So we have to come up with where it's greater weight. So we've got better information that shows, hey, this isn't, that's preponderance. The other one says, hey, no, look, you've got to come up here and show it's a much higher level of proof. And so it's always our job.
So it's the member's ability to have preponderance to get the claim approved.
Well,
And it's the fund's job to say, no, we actually want to contest that. They have the higher probability.
So let me give this another try, and I apologize. This is why I think the comparison is difficult. In any given case, there's going to be one party who has the burden of proof. And so what these presumptions do is to shift that to Fpdr and then to define what the standard of proof is. So like in this House Bill 4062, the standard of proof is clear and convincing evidence, highly probable that what Fpdr is asserting is correct, which would be essentially proving a negative in those types of cases. And in the example we used of the existing presumptions in the charter, the ones that the voters have passed, not the other, there are some other presumptions that have caused charter amendments, but the 5306, section 5306D presumptions, that burden is at Fpdr's as well, but it's preponderance of the evidence there. So just for sake of comparison, but you're not going to have two different standards applying in the same case, if that makes sense, or the same claim. Okay, thank you.
That makes sense.
So can I go back to, Sam, you were describing the overlay of these two. So the existing charter would not be changed, And so
Right.
this would, if passed, this would overlay on top of it. So let me cite an example. So for example, if it were a police officer's claim, just the charter provision would apply.
Yes,
Correct.
because,
Okay.
yeah, you're
Because there
right.
is no corresponding state statute. Okay. And if it were something like a firefighter, but it was hernia or AIDS or hepatitis B, the charter standard would
Right.
again apply. But if it were something that fell under the expanded definition of heart disease over to something that fit under cardiovascular or some other respiratory thing that wasn't pneumonia or tuberculosis, then the new statute, if adopted, would apply
Yeah,
for
the
that. And the
pneumonia-
higher standard for,
Pneumonia and tuberculosis, since they are respiratory, would still be first looked at under this new statute because they're respiratory. The thing, let's say they've not been employed for 5 years. They don't fall under the statute because they haven't been employed for 5 years, but you come over to the FPDR plan, we don't have the 5-year limit, so we would then take a look at it under
the-
this part of the
the
charter.
greater weight, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
So remember we talked about it with PTSD, also with that. You start out with one that is potentially the most favorable with them under their condition. So you'd start out looking, does this condition apply under this statute? If so, we would process the claim under the statute. If for some reason it doesn't, or we make a decision that it doesn't, so we'll then look at 5306D. If it doesn't apply there, then we look at our general work-related conditions. So if we deny a claim under this thing here, we still have to look at all the options here for it. So it's until we've looked through all the possibilities this claim could be evaluated under, then you would make your final denial to that.
Okay.
They can't appeal if they don't like our decision on that we say you're not covered under this workers' comp statute. They can't appeal it. But if your claim's approved, I don't know why they wouldn't appeal it. But anyway, I'm just saying that they can't appeal that decision as we move
Got it.
through.
Thank you.
Okay.
And then procedurally, since there is no corresponding retirement for an initial medical exam on hiring, if this is passed, would that probably necessitate, at least for firefighters, that there be some exam on hiring?
That'll have to be an
Or does it
issue that
already
I
happen?
think that,
It does happen right now, and I don't know if,
Okay.
and you're getting into a claim, I want to be careful to say, is that a sufficient one to qualify for this? I don't know. We're going to have to do research on that. We're going to have to come through, because one advantage is this statute's been in existence for 30 years. So there's some case law that's out there that we can look to. But again, we have to administer also under the charter, because this only applies to how we look at part of the claim. There's other requirements they have to do. But so we'll have some guidance from the case, but we'll have to go through. There'll be things we're learning as we go through with this.
And as you can imagine, there's case law on whether an exam is sufficient in order to meet this predicate criteria for the presumption to apply. I mean, there's case law for a statute that's that. In fact, I came across one today from the mid-'90s, I think, under the workers' comp law, as to whether a particular, I don't remember if it was an EKG or what it was, but if that test was enough, in that case, that was an issue in dispute. I haven't seen, the trend, at least on the reported cases, is those aren't the issues that are being brought up to the Court of Appeals so much anymore. But there is some guidance out there.
Yeah, with that. We were going to try to do some costs. Kim has been looking and talking with some of the other carriers that have been administering this. We're getting information from them. It's not as clear as we thought it would, but give us some guidance of costs with it. I'm not seeing a reason why we would see costs significantly jump with it, but again, you're going to be more conditions fall under a presumption, so you're likely to have more claims approved. And again, remember, the presumption's a higher standard to rebut. You may have some people who have been self-screening them. It's the same thing we talked about with PTSD, who are not filing claims in the past, so they may file some claims. So we expect to see more claims coming out. Also, some of these conditions that are covered or mentioned in the statute have some lifelong tail end. Hypertension never really goes away, so you'll always be maintaining that, and so do some of these cardiovascular and respiratory things. So this will hit the costs of post-retirement medical, and you saw that medical is some of our biggest costs. So it's not that it won't have a zero impact on us, but we're not anticipating a huge impact, but we're trying to see if we can able to give a little bit more guidance to ourselves and potentially to you what it may have on this.
Thank you.
So that's just informational. As Franco said, the legislative session hasn't started. I've given my idea, either this can slide really quick and through because it's very simple, or it may just get brushed aside because it's not any of the big things. We don't know, and so our May next,
We will know more in early March.
early March, our next board meeting will tell you, and I'll give you an email here as soon as I know one way or another, but I probably won't know until the actual end of the session unless it goes through and gets passed. But it can, some of the bills can sit all the way up to the last 2 days and then just go through a flurry of things to get pushed through. So as soon as I know anything, I'll let you know. We'll go from there. Yeah, Nelson, we'd ask you to come on up and talk about.
Thank you. Good afternoon again, Acting Chair, members of the Board of Trustees. Thank you, Sam, and members for the opportunity to appear in front of you. A quick little caveat or disclaimer, if you will. Sam has already mentioned that this is a bill sponsored by the Oregon State Firefighters Council, not by Local 43. I always find myself hesitating at this point in terms of making sure that what I'm about to discuss, or this discussion itself, is not the initiation of bargaining. I don't want to, bottom line is I'm here truly on behalf of the Oregon State Firefighters Council. To the extent that I am deemed to be lobbying today, again, it's on behalf of the State Council and not Local 43. So thank you for allowing me to offer that kind of disclaimer. A quick point or two. One, as Sam indicated, and I appreciate the ability to use first names in this forum, including my friend and colleague, Franco. And I say that he and I go toe-to-toe often in our respective law practices. The presumption being presented by statute that would, yes, and Sam and Franco have accurately, I think, very, very nicely summarized how this would apply. This particular statute, though, actually has not, it's been on the books since 1961, not 1990. It has been amended a few times, 1973, I think, maybe 78, 79. But what I refer to as the firefighter's heart and lung presumption, that's actually been on the books, since the early 1960s. And my next point is, and Sam and Franco touched on this appropriately, and that is there's a certain simplicity to the proposition to this statute. And as Sam indicated, that's because the language for implementation is the same as we find in the cancer and PTSD presumptions, which, again, the route was in 1990 and then last session was rather to go through this whole charter change, go to the voters, and do we really amend the charter and so on. As you know, the charter has a provision that says if there is outside law that requires action by the fund, then there's a provision whereby the city council and you folks just simply adopt and live by this, okay? So that's why we took, that is to say the State Council of Firefighters took this approach. It's clean. You have already been here twice before with the cancer presumption and now with the PTSD presumption. Point being, and I think Sam and Franco recognize or mentioned this as well, there should not be any real difficulty in integrating this new presumption it would be integrated as the cancer presumption and as the PTSD presumption has been integrated into the charter and into the FPDR work. Will there be some hiccups and so on? Will there be, as Sam indicated, well, is this under the charter presumption because this happens to be a hernia and not a cardiovascular disease? Sure, there will be those kinds of, all right, to which conditions does this presumption, this new presumption apply? But assuming that it is, for example, one of the cancers that is covered by the cancer presumption, it is, all right, well, then this new presumption would apply. If it is one of the conditions under the existing charter that is not covered by this new presumption, well, then this presumption would simply not apply to it. So bottom line is, I'm here to answer questions in terms of how, kind of the hows and whys, but in its simplest terms, the State Council is asking that the state statute be amended to provide a presumption that would apply to Portland also. And not to get too deep into the history and the reeds and weeds of workers' compensation law, but this fund, that is to say, the workers' compensation role or purpose of this fund exists for one reason, and that's because Oregon State statute, and it's number 656.027, defines who are subject workers, who are subject to the State Workers' Compensation Act. And just like, forgive me, just like newspaper carriers are not subject workers, and there are others, executives and corporations, not subject workers, well, guess what? There's a paragraph that says firefighters and police officers covered by a disability retirement plan in municipalities of 200,000 or more are not subject workers. All right, well, guess what? There's only one municipality that meets that definition, at least I think only one, and that's the city of Portland. So the State Council of Firefighters, looking at this, are saying, you know what? On behalf of their largest group of professional firefighters in the entire state that the State Council is concerned about and represents, it is finally time to have this presumption apply to the Portland firefighters, just like this presumption applies to all other professional firefighters in the state of Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you, Nelson.
The city has lobbyists that go down to Salem and things like that to lobby different things. But none of them speak on behalf of FPDNR and retirement.
There's an issue with that because it's, as the state legislature sees us, we are an arm of the city of Portland. So they do look to it. We had this issue come up with PTSD. What can I say? Because I had to work very closely with government relations, so when I spoke with things, I didn't cross a line that tried to separate us from the city of Portland. It's because we are not a separate entity as far as a legislative district with it or anything. So we have already been in contact with, I've talked with both Commissioner Hardesty's staff, I've talked with Chief Boone, I've talked with government relations, so I know what everybody's position is on that. There will be some discussion to a joint, presentation and potentially to the legislature when it comes through. And I think at this point, the city and FPDNR probably do not have any difference in their opinion on the supporting of the bill. So I don't think we're going to, us be going one way and the city going another way.
Good.
As far as what we have on that.
Real quick, Mr. Chair, if I might, I want to pick up on a point stated by Sam and Franco, and that is, because this presumption has literally been around since the 1960s, and even if it was just since the 1990s, the terms, the words in this presumption, including the definition of the burden of proof, including what is cardiovascular, including what constitutes a pre-employment physical exam, those have all been vetted. They have all been litigated and defined by the courts. So applying this to the city of Portland should not open up some whole new battle between Mr. Luchin and myself in terms of what do these terms mean.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you. All right, anything else on that subject?
Nope, I think that's it. And just a reminder, this has not been gone through, it's not a bill, so I will keep you appraised of how it moves through the legislature. And then if it does pass, then I've got some steps to do. One is we'll work with the city council to adopt it as part of an amendment to the policy, and also as well as, we'll have to change our administrative rules. It's also same thing we did with PTSD, so it's simple, but we won't even be thinking in that direction until a final disposition on the bill is done.
Okay, Nelson, you have something else?
Thank you, Mr. Acting Chair. This, what I'm about to say, does come under the heading of lobbying. And that is based on the presentation from Sam and Franco and what you have. I would be urging that this Board of Trustees, along with the mayor's office, along with the city's public relations or public, I would ask that you do join and add your voices to passage of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would agree with that. I don't want any, I think before the board has any type of positive or negative, I would not encourage any type of negative publicity from the board, at least as far as my concern is.
What I did with the PTSD, because if you all wanted to do it, you have to formally pass something as to what you want to do. I mean, it'd have to come as a resolution from you all, is that I said that you had no stance. I mean, and that's not considered bad. It's just that it's better than you had a negative stance on it. So you had no stance. For PTSD, the city had no official stance on the bill. And mine was initially started out as support the concept but can't support the bill as written. And then as the negotiation came through at the end, I said, I have no questions at all. You've answered my questions and concerns of the bill that I had up front.
So we could have a positive stance on it.
What?
We could have a positive regard if people were to ask instead of no stance. We could have a.
Well, I'm just saying, if you of a board do it, you would have to pass a motion to officially do that. In addition, we have to, again, go through government relations because you are going through the city of Portland because your existence is here because of the city charter and stuff. And I've had to tiptoe through this process with PTSD. I'd like to do it again because we've got to make sure if you were in lockstep with the rest of the city, I don't think they have a problem. But if at any time you guys diverge, there might be some issues with it. And I just don't, and again, so if,
I was just basically asking if that's an informational question.
I'll handle it in such a way that, there is no, the board, at least at minimum, the board has no concerns with this being passed. I'll just say, just based on the discussions with the board, we don't have to have an official stance on it unless you want to. And then we'll have to talk about how we get the board to come up with an official decision to write it and then work through government relations. So let you guys think of what you want to do. You can get back to me or work with Josh on how you can do that.
Yeah, and I would like to say, if the city is not going to take a stance on this either way, but I would like to know, I guess, what stance they would take, because I know how I feel about it.
I have an idea of the way they're going with it. I'm going to keep my mouth shut because it hasn't been finalized with all the key people. I do not think you will be unhappy with it, so let's put it that way. Okay.
Well, I mean, in the future, too, it's like kind of figuring out how this process would work, so, if we felt like the city was, going to lobby for something that affected our people and who we're supposed to be,
I will always be
administering
involved in
this.
anything, any bill that's either lobbied for or by or against, by the city in either way that impacts FPDR. I will always be involved, and I'll bring my staff to whoever's the appropriate person to go in and to attend to it. I don't think we're going to have something that's going to be in necessarily a conflicting interest with the board on what they do, but I would hope this kind of stuff, if they came up, would be in the long session so we have some time to react and respond to it. This one's going to be over in 35 days with it, and so there isn't much time to react to things. So I know how, I infer very strongly how you feel with it, and I don't think it differs a whole lot for the city, but you didn't hear that from me because at this point they have not made their official stance with it. So I don't think this will be an issue with this one, but in the future, I'm very much aware of that. And we will make sure that if there's a divergence of opinion with the city and FPDR, we will deal with it somehow.
Yeah. And I
again,
appreciate
hope
the
that-
updates, but
yeah.
sometimes, if we only have a meeting every 2 months,
Yeah.
we would probably need an update either through an email or,
Oh, I'll let you know as it progresses through what's happening to this particular bill, and if there's any other important things, if there's hearings, who's going to attend the hearings, that kind of thing.
what's the time frame for the session?
So, let's see, I had this.
35 days?
It's 35 days, starting February 3rd, ending March 8th.
So it'll be done before our next meeting?
Yeah.
Yeah, so any updates that you receive, please forward them to
Yeah,
us.
I'll do that on this one.
Quick point of information, may I obtain a copy of this?
Do we have an extra handout, that handout here? I think Kathy will get that for you.
Thank you again, members, for letting me appear.
Thank you.
Okay. So we just have a couple of real quick little things to go. Information item for FPDR updates. Stacy had talked to you about our lease and that we have a cheaper lease than would be if we were going into the city. Stacy didn't give you some of the backgrounds on that. In 2016, we were instructed by Mayor Hales at the time that FPDR would move into the Portland building, pay the Portland building rents, and do everything. Thanks to Nancy Hartline, who was Stacy's predecessor, and Stacy. And with help, we convinced the city to get us out of that whole process and allow us to control where we rent, where our lease is, et cetera, with that. So we are no longer going to be pulled into it. Part of it, she called it's rent stabilization. You have different bureaus pay different rents right now for downtown. They were going to apply a single rent level to all bureaus. And we would have the cheapest rent. We would have to raise our rent and basically subsidize other bureaus. And I said, you can't make FPDR fund do that. So anyway, we went through a lot of gyrations, and we are totally out of that, and the city will not be controlling where FPDR rents or stays. The reason why I bring that up, because in 2017, we signed a new lease. We extended the lease we have in our offices, which we've had since 1985. Normally, we would have extended it 5 years, but at that time, we had this lease, we were still under the instruction that you were going to move into the Portland building. Well, they're moving into the Portland building now. So what we got creative with the contract was we wrote a 3-year contract and included 3 6-month extensions on that, options to extend it 6 months. So it's only basically a 4.5-year contract, but we have to actively come in and exercise the option. We're coming up on an option that's going to start in October, because that's when the 3 years would end, and that would extend the lease to April 21. When the board approved the lease agreement back in 2017, it included all the options, and the board gave full approval to the lease and with the options to exercise. Well, city council, due to their structure, because they have to approve leases, they only approved the 3 years. So I'm going to go back to them. So I'm just giving you a heads up. I'm going back to them to have the city council approve the first option, and then we'll have to go back 6 months later to approve the second option and that. And again, 7 or 8 months before the last option or before the entire lease expires, we will be getting out and meeting with a real estate broker, which is what we did back in 2017. They'll look at options around here, the cost to move, et cetera. And one of the biggest obstacles to us moving is it would cost us $150,000 to $200,000 just to move, because we'd have to move in a new place and replace all our furniture. So that was a huge cost. Even if you could maybe negotiate rates that are a little bit cheaper, you offset by the actual move costs. But that stuff we'll explain to you at all when we come back through there. So we'll offer, do we move or do we try to stay here and renegotiate a lease? And you can get better lease agreements if you go 5 years with it than that. But anyway, so I just want to, we're going to exercise the first one, but I have to have that decision made by May 1, and so we're going to go to the city council, and I'll just send you an email out that, yay, they passed it or didn't pass it. But again, the board approved the full lease. I'll jump to the last one, future meetings. So March, we'll start the annual adjustment review discussion. We do that too much because this last year we took two different board meetings to do, so that's why we started early in March. We'll do a legislative update wrap-up at that point, which I envision you will know everything about this bill before you get there, and I don't think there's going to be anything else applying to FPDR. In May, we'll do the tax anticipation notes, which Stacy talked about, wrap up the annual adjustment review. July, again, we have nothing on the July agenda at this point, but we'll keep that on the calendar and make the
Any
decision.
reason that looks like it's not going to work out, I'm open to doing something in one of the interim months, like
Yeah, I mean, we
April.
could,
Yeah.
we did this just to make it simple for you all to attend. You didn't have to have a second time, and simple so a lot of people here in the room could attend. If necessary, if it looks like that's not going to work out, we can schedule a separate.
Yeah, I just don't want that to get drawn out too far into the
Well,
future. Yeah.
Josh is the one doing it, I'll work with him to make sure we get it and try to control, get some times for everybody. So I would say if March is going to look like a problem, unfortunately Elizabeth, hers was really a last minute, something came up. Josh was somewhat last minute too, but anyway.
The March meeting is up a week, it's the 17th, not the 4th.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, spring break. We've always been asked not to schedule during spring break.
Sure we all have that at the right date.
There's 5 Tuesdays in March. 17.
Yeah, thanks.
St. Patty's Day, right?
Okay.
Hey, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, anything else?
Nope.
All right, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second.
Got a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion's adjourned. Oh, Libby, hold it.
Thank you.
Clarify, that's
Maybe
March
just one.
17th, right, Kathy? March 17th of what?
I need one of those things, John Roberts. What is that? It looks like an hourglass.
Yeah, exactly.